It's great to have back on the program today Brian Klaas, who's an associate professor of global politics at University College London and also author of the new book Corruptible: Who Gets Power and How It Changes Us. Brian, always great to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.
So, when we think about something like who obtains power in society, we could even narrow it down and say in kind of Western democracies, in capitalist Western democracies, there's a lot of different approaches we can look at. We can look at sort of psychological factors and personality factors about individuals. We can talk about, the leg up that the economic circumstances that one is born into might play as a factor. We can talk about the role of media, so many different things. What are some of the, or maybe the most important filters through which we can start to think about who ends up holding power in society?
Yes, so I think that most of the debate around people in power is like a tip of the iceberg problem, where we tend to focus almost all of our attention on the people who are actually in power, the ones who we can see, right, the top of the iceberg. And the real problem I think we have is underneath the surface, which is the people who don't seek power. And so, you think about like a high school basketball team. You never expect that basketball team to be a representative sample of height in the school, right? There's a certain group of people that are going to try out for the team. The same is obviously true with power. Now, I've looked, the book draws on a wide variety of research from evolutionary biology to neuroscience and psychology and so on. So I started to ask people who study this, is there a power gene? Is there something in us that causes us to seek power? And there is a study that shows a significant correlation between a specific gene and people who end up in power. But we can't say whether that's because they have certain traits, they're more outgoing, they're more affable, whatever. But we do have some evidence that there is some genetic basis to power attainment. And then, of course, you filter that through all the stuff in society where, it's obvious that white men have an easier time getting power in Western democracies, but also that we seek certain things in our rulers. And this ranges from everything from evolutionary psychology, where we look at, why is it that we turn to strong men in times of crises, to this amazing study I found about basically asking children to pick someone to captain their imaginary ship in this computer simulation. And they basically are shown two faces, and there's no other information given. They pick one of the faces to be the captain. What they don't know is that the two faces are the winner and the runner-up of the French parliamentary elections. And with astonishing accuracy, they tend to pick the winner, which reflects this horrible truth that often we have such superficial assessments when we pick leaders. So there are dozens of reasons why this happens, but I think we have to acknowledge the problem and the self-selection that goes into power before we can actually fix it.
With some of these things, there would be sort of a legitimate question to ask about, it's sort of like a chicken egg thing, and I'll explain what I mean. When we think about the alleged corrupting influence of power, it's often said that absolute power corrupts. But is there something about corrupt people who are already corrupt predisposed to put themselves in those positions that kind of reverses the causation?
Yeah, so I'll answer it in two ways. The first is that there's this other study that I found phenomenal, where it basically asks people to roll a dice, and it says if you roll a 6, you get more money. If you roll a 1, you get no money, right? So there's an incentive to lie about it. So there's variations of how many people cheat in this, basically. But what they found was that when they ran this study in corrupt countries, like in India, where being a civil servant is somewhere where you can get off the books pay.
Yep.
What happened was the people who lied about their dice rolls were disproportionately likely to want to become civil servants. They did this at a school. If you do the exact same study in somewhere like Denmark, it's exactly the opposite. The people who report their scores completely honestly, they're the ones who want to go into public service. So a corrupt system draws in corrupt people, and a clean system draws in clean people. So the system really, really matters. I talk about this actually in an essay I have out in the Atlantic today with policing in the United States. So there's this phenomenon that I think doesn't get enough attention when we talk about body cameras and trying to change what the police do with police reforms. And we have to think about who the police are and who wants to become a police officer. So, I looked at this ad that was used for recruitment in Doraville, Georgia, this town of 10,000 people outside Atlanta. And it's a caricature, right? It's literally like these guys in a tank driving through in the sort of, the Punisher logo is flashing on screen about vigilante justice. They throw smoke grenades out. That's the image of policing. I talked to New Zealand's police force, and they basically tried to counteract this. So they ran a multi-year recruitment scheme that used funny videos, made policing look enjoyable, all about public service, had lots of women and ethnic minorities in it. And their applications shot through the roof for non-traditional officers,
Right.
and their abuse levels fell at the same time. So, I think that there's an acknowledgement we have to make that the way we perceive systems of power really, really matters for who seeks it. And it's why I'm particularly worried about what's happening in the US right now with these insane zealots threatening school board members for mask mandates and so on.
Yep.
Because they're making public service toxic, and they're going to ensure that good, decent people just simply self-select out of systems of power, and that we're left with the people who the insane zealots basically agree with putting their hat in the ring.
Right. You have that issue. You also have, I mean, it's not necessarily related to what we're talking about here, but I've pointed out that those who want to hurt public education funded through taxes love the school board stuff because they see it as, hey, if these schools seem really chaotic, it might encourage parents to say, I'm pulling my kid out. I'm going to do homeschooling, private school, whatever, which will, of course, further weaken schools and sort of exacerbate. Let's go back a little bit to the police thing, because that's interesting, and you've talked about that. There recently, two stories on policing have sort of come together. One is what was sort of increased by the George Floyd protests and questions of police brutality and bad apples that spoil the bunch, et cetera. We also have the anti-vaccine stuff, which is leading to, it really doesn't seem like more than 1% in the worst cases of officers leaving, 34 officers in New York City out of 36,000. A few emails that came in, people said, hey, when we talk about the bad apples that spoil the bunch on the police brutality stuff, it might be the same people who are now leaving because of the vaccine stuff. This could be a blessing in disguise, but that's not really a strategy for dealing with this issue of policing. What is your sense of, there's the reform movement, there's the defund movement, there's all these different ideas and approaches. You mentioned one in New Zealand that was a very different approach. How should we be thinking about, big picture, the issue of policing in the United States and who is doing the policing?
Yeah, so I mean, the stuff I talked about in New Zealand is a first step, which is to say you need to make the police appealing to normal, decent people who want to serve the public that don't have a military background, right? Veterans are overrepresented in the police dramatically in the US by design, by the way. And that's not necessarily a problem. It's just that, if you think that your job is the same as when you were patrolling Fallujah when you're in Ferguson, right, that's going to be an issue. You're going to be more likely to be a little trigger happy and so on. And we need a lot more community officers that have no background in the military and actually don't want power. So the recruitment is part of it. There's other stuff I write about in the book that's about how you sort of deter abuses for people once they're in power. I think it is easier to recruit good apples than it is to make bad apples behave better. But we do have bad apples in the police. So what are we going to do? One of the keys is rotation. So there's a lot of studies that look at how comfort and sort of closed systems create abuse. So in police, for example, this is the sort of blue wall of silence and the sort of your partner will always have your back, even if you're doing something really illegal and abusive. So the Metropolitan Police in London, for example, did some work of rotating partners through regularly, and it had really good results. And there's also loads of psychological research where you have participants play games, basically, in which they can collude in order to win money. And if you work with the same person through multiple rounds of the game, the odds that you're going to try to give bribes to win the game go massively through the roof compared to if you're constantly rotating people through, because you have, this sort of fresh face that you don't know is necessarily on your side. And interestingly, this data shows the same thing, whether they run it in Germany or China or the US. So, I have, at the end of the book, there's this section on 10 ways to fix the problem. And they're basically things that all need to happen because there's no silver bullet. This is a massive problem. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that we don't think about systems of power enough this way. We have to design every single system from the police to politics with the assumption, which is true, by the way, that bad people are disproportionately likely to seek power, disproportionately likely to get it, and disproportionately likely to be able to stay in it longer than they should. And so once you take that as the starting point, then you redesign the system and think, how can we invert that? And I think nothing has been tried. I mean, that's the thing that I find so maddening, is that all of the debates around police, I mean, there's some defund movements and so on that have their ideas about, fundamentally transforming policing, but the rest of them, body cameras, I mean, it's a good idea, but is that really going to solve the problem? There's 1,000 people who are getting killed by cops in the United States every year. In New Zealand, there's about a dozen a decade, right? Maybe less than that. So obviously the population's different, but we have a massive, massive problem on our hands. And I don't think around the edges reforms are going to solve it.
What are the different fields in which these dynamics are a problem? I mean, I think police is one that gets a lot of attention. Politicians and psychopathy predispositions is sometimes talked about. I think corporate CEOs is one that gets discussion. We don't hear about this dynamic among postal workers or nurses, for example. So, like, what are the other fields where these dynamics show up more?
Well, it's very interesting you asked that, because there's two sections in the book where I try to bring this dynamic much closer to home. And there's one which is a really crazy story about this guy named Steve Rauchi, who was a psychopathic custodian in Schenectady, New York. And in order to rise through the ranks in his school district, did some crazy stuff. I mean, he started using explosives, and he's in jail for a very long time now. And that job, that was just a personality trait. So that's, if you have a psychopath who's power hungry, you put them in anywhere and they're going to try to rise through the ranks through any means necessary. But there's actually, as you say, a trait to this that is disproportionately selecting in certain jobs. So politics is an obvious one, but also one that's really interesting is a place where you have power for the sake of power with no real other benefits. So I explore this with homeowners associations. There's a great series of stories that I've discovered and characters that are very interesting people who basically, it's like this horrible job where you spend your time trying to impose fines on somebody down the block who put their bin out, 10 minutes too early or something on a Sunday. Who's that going to appeal to when the pay is either non-existent or terrible? Well, it's the person who's power hungry and can't fulfill that in another area of life. So those types of positions are also magnets for power abusers, which is why you get what we call the petty tyrant effect of the person who rules over a completely insignificant domain, but is going to abuse every possible ounce of power that they have. And I think that's something that a lot of people experience in their daily lives.
As a general rule, are the approaches that are more likely or have worked more effectively about, as you mentioned with police, it's hire good apples rather than convert? Does that apply universally?
Yeah, you sort of need to do all of the above, to be honest, because the problem is not just the individual, it's also the system, right? I mean, if you have a good person who goes into a rotten police department, they're going to probably behave in a rotten way. And one of the more unusual things that I did that might be of interest to your viewers and listeners is I took a ski lesson with Paul Bremer, who ran Iraq in 2003, and now he's a ski instructor in Vermont, believe it or not. So he's an interesting case study because, a lot of people see him as the villain, and I understand completely why. I mean, what he did in 2003, the record speaks for itself. But what's interesting about him is that he was previously an ambassador to Malawi and Norway, and it appears that he did a very good job. I mean, most people think that he was really effective and sort of had lots of integrity in that position and so on. And then he goes into Iraq where everything is broken and he's basically, a de facto viceroy of a dictatorship. And all of a sudden, everything he has to do is these awful decisions with morally dubious consequences and so on. And so I think one of the things that we also have to acknowledge is not to absolve people who do bad things in positions of power. It's that it's more complicated sometimes than it initially appears. And that the system also needs our attention because, I like to think that I would behave well no matter what, but you see the evidence from around the world and you take people and put them in new systems and they do behave in different ways. There's a study of bankers in Italy where southern Italy is known as being more corrupt than northern Italy. Yes. And the employees who move between the same bank but different branches start embezzling at higher rates if they're in the south. So, there's things like that where we can see that it's both the individual and the system that need our attention.
This may seem like a sort of divergence, but I think it could be an interesting one. The role of power within other species, within the animal kingdom. What do we know that mirrors Homo sapiens, and what differences are there?
Yeah, it's a great question. This is one of the most enjoyable parts of the research because I'm a political scientist, so I don't spend a lot of time with people who study hyenas and bees and primates and so on. But I did for the book,
Yeah.
and it was really, really fascinating. Primates are a great window for us because it's similar in terms of some of the brain functions and some social structures without the culture, right? And so you can look at how power affects individuals. There's an amazing study. I interviewed a professor and doctor out in North Carolina who looks at hierarchy and drug addiction in macaque monkeys. And one of the craziest things is that when you basically give monkeys, you put them in groups of 4, they instantly form a hierarchy from 1 to 4. And then you offer them the choice between cocaine, where they push a button and they get intravenous cocaine, or banana pellets. They push a different button and they get banana pellets. And what's amazing about this is that every time you run this study, the top 2 monkeys, the ones that are on the top of the hierarchy, don't take the cocaine. They take the banana pellets. The ones who are on the bottom basically self-medicate. And this happens even if the alpha male in this group gets reassigned to another group of 4 and then ends up on the bottom, all of a sudden the exact same thing happens. So it doesn't matter about the individual. I also looked at corruption in, believe it or not, bees and wasps. And it's an amazing story about systems and individual behavior. I won't go into the whole story, but basically the gist of it is the way the hive is set up between different kinds of species of wasps, whether it's transparent or not, whether it's easy to detect wrongdoing or not by what are actually called police wasps or police bees, that has a massive, massive effect on how selfish the behavior of the individual wasp or bee is. And I think these lessons that we have from the animal kingdom are actually quite instructive because most of the time when we talk about these problems, we're talking about them within the silos of Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's worth stripping that away and saying, okay, there's some universal lessons that we can learn, and we might as well draw them from wherever we can, even if it's from an unexpected place.
That's super interesting. Yeah. And not that long ago, I read Jared Diamond's book, The Third Chimpanzee, which also talks a lot about sort of the parts that are analogous and parts that are not between humans and chimpanzees. And there's a lot of different layers to that you don't really see if the focus is like American partisan politics, I guess, is the point that you're making.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's some problems in society that actually can be solved, right? I mean, I think we focus on so much stuff that is the partisan battle of the day, which makes complete sense.
Yeah.
But we can actually make systems of power behave better for all of us. And that requires some outside the box thinking that might have reference points that aren't our typical culture wars.
Right.
It's hard to get worked up about somebody making a point about wasp corruption, for example. It's not exactly going to rile you up
in the same way.
Yeah. Wasps and so on. So I think we can draw these lessons. The other point that I make, by the way, is as part of the research for this book, I met with lots of really awful people. I met with lots of former despots, war criminals, all sorts around the world. And one of the points that I often make is you would find it super weird if somebody who was an expert on hyenas never encountered a hyena, never studied one, never went up to one and observed it. And yet there's a lot of stuff in politics where these monsters among us still are living, breathing, and willing to talk to people. So I went to study them to figure out what makes them tick and what power does to them. And I think we need to do more of that because these problems are preventable, but we have to sort of strip away some of the sort of preconceptions or revulsion that we have and start to think, okay, we're stuck with some of these people. How can we make them behave better? How can we replace them? How can we make sure that better people follow them? And that requires some sort of outside the partisan frame thinking, I think.
The book is Corruptible: Who Gets Power and How It Changes Us. We've been speaking with the book's author, Brian Klaas. Brian, so great talking about this and always really appreciate your time.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me.